United States of Lead is an informative podcast that may contain sensitive material and the occasional F-bomb. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to United States of Lead, a podcast about crime, mental decline, and the lead thread that links them. This week, we are joined with a very special guest. Paul and I will just let you introduce yourself for our listeners.
Okay, my name's Tim Pye. Actually, I live in Buckinghamshire in southern England. I'm a retired IT consultant and previously worked in pharmaceuticals and ecological research, and also worked on quite a bit of health data systems. I'm not really retired. I've just stopped being paid. So
You're retired from being paid, but still working.
Voluntary work. I run a local arboretum and I help out at the local food bank, but most of my time is spent on lead poisoning prevention campaigns and trying to get something done in the UK.
Tim, I have to say, I can't remember if it was on LinkedIn or just somewhere in your digital footprint. I saw that one of your titles, like your official title on something, was simply volunteer. And I thought that's something we all need to aspire to. I'm ready. I'm here. I have skills. I have experience, and I'm available to share this. How cool is that?
Yeah, that's what I thought when I retired from IT. I thought, I'm going to be able to be in demand. But it's surprising how insular some charities can be. They don't want somebody coming in and telling them how to do things or telling them they're doing it wrong. So it's an interesting relationship, because I'm sure you find out that within charitable voluntary organizations, the politics are worse than they are in any commercial enterprise.
They have their own enterprise, don't they? It's a nest egg to protect of sorts.
Yeah, that's right.
So you mentioned your previous work. What caused you to advocate for lead poisoning awareness?
Yeah, well, that really came from when we moved in 2013. We moved into an old house built in the 1920s. And I was doing a lot of renovation, DIY things, and then found out that what I've been doing was really quite dangerous, that I've been doing all the wrong things, not following the rules that I was ignorant of. So dry sanding lead paint and scraping lead paint and things like that. And it just sort of occurred to me when I woke up one morning, I wonder if this is okay. And then did a bit of research and was really shocked by what I found out. And the more I read, the worse it got. And I kind of had a nervous breakdown, and I was talking to a counsellor who said, well, if you're so concerned, why are you not telling other people? And so I sort of did.
Did you notice anything? Is that why you looked into it? Were you experiencing anything that made you look into it?
No, I wouldn't say that I identified any particular symptoms of acute lead poisoning. I did have a blood test and I had an elevated level.
Okay. So speaking of home repairs, I just want to ask, here in the US, and we did an episode on it, those home renovation shows, we have a lot of them. Yeah. Is that something that you guys have that's pretty popular in the UK? And do they also not follow lead safe practices when they're doing these shows?
They do not follow lead safe practices. And I'll be shouting at the television saying, there are no rules here. We don't have rules like the RRP rule, no lead safe contractor accreditation.
Oh, wow.
There are some guidelines, but
That was going to be my next question, because here when you're renting, if you're renting from a place that was built before, I think 1978 or 1976, they have to just give you this flyer that says there might be lead paint in here. Not that they're going to do anything about it, but they just have to make you aware. Are people needing to do that? No?
Doesn't happen. Surveyors, when they're doing a survey of a property before buying it, they might mention that there could be lead paint or lead
But
pipe.
it's not required.
There's no requirements. It's not like in France, they do. Any home that was built before 1949 has to have a test for lead paint on sale.
Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting.
But the UK, no, we've got no regulations at all about that. We're trying to get change. We're trying to encourage the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors to advise their surveyors that they should include lead in paint pipes and soil.
Yeah.
There are leaflets around, but they're not generally made available, and certainly there's no disclosure rule.
Interesting.
One of the things that we keep going back to is just how deeply sensible some of this regulation seems. The risk is just so high, the dangers are so severe, and it seems to be so prevalent. So greater access to testing, or some things on your website with the paint stirrers, like that just seems so sensible, and also even like a cost savings if everyone has to use the same mass produced. But I really appreciate your story where you're doing some work on your home and you're just asking these sensible questions like, oh, well, let me just look into this. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. It sounds like your story is something that should happen just to be repeated over and over with just about any homeowner, any builder. Why do you think it's not? How come that isn't occurring more regularly?
Well, put it down. There's an acronym for LEAD, L-E-A-D, which is laziness, excuses, apathy, and denial.
Wow. Yeah.
Yes. That's what we've been exploring. That's it.
Well, that's our show.
Yeah.
And what happens is there's a lot of not enough awareness, of course. And somebody said, if it doesn't hurt you, it doesn't harm you. And so therefore, tradesmen, builders and so on, they'll think, they'll be aware of immediate dangers that hurt you if you fall off a ladder or something. But when it's something that's very systemic, that's going to cause long-term trouble, it's certainly asbestos has been raised as a health and safety issue, and that gets a lot of attention. I think the problem is, especially in the UK, the costs would be borne by homeowners. And I think this is listening to one of your other podcasts, and you're talking about the responsibility gets put onto the individual rather than the people who are maybe responsible or those who could effect the solution more effectively. So therefore, we're going to tell people, your house is poisonous.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to fix it. It's your fault. That's a very hard message.
Yeah. Well, and how long it takes. Because once you find out, you've got to be gone for at least 6 months. I mean, where are you going to go? Like you just leave your house like, all right, we'll be back.
Well, I take the approach that if you're trying to go for full abatement, then it's going to be really hard. But you basically deal with the worst first. So this house I've got here, it used to get fairly high levels and done a lot of analysis of dust samples. It used to be bad, but now it's not. And we didn't have to move out. It was just a case of dealing with the hazards and preventing any lead. So basically in this room, right, that door you can see over there, that's got lead paint under the top layer. The door itself was stripped. There's a thing called door dipping. I don't know if you do that in the US, where you send the door away, a painted door, and it comes back with the paint removed, not the lead removed. And in fact, you're in a much worse state because you've now taken all what might be good layers of paint and you get back to bad layers of paint. And that was very leady, but you found that if you varnish it enough times, there's no lead coming out of it. So question of learning the techniques, and some of these I've put onto the website or probably on the lead group as well, about sharing how to deal with the risk. So now most of the time, I will get no detect on lead in dust samples.
Nice.
You can't control it.
Yeah, that's empowering for people versus, there's nothing I can do about this, or if I do, it's all on me. So that's nice to hear, because we should be transitioning to making this about people empowering themselves to, be able to handle this. There was a story, an NPR story here about a mom, and her 2 kids where they found lead. In the comments, there were people with young children where their pediatricians are telling them that it's not a big deal. There's even health professionals where they're being told, oh, that was something that was an issue in the 40s and the 50s, and you don't have to worry about that anymore. And people blow it out of proportion. Yeah, what kind of response would you have to that?
That's the experience we get. I mean, we haven't done any real survey, but just the anecdotal thing is parents saying that their doctors just mocked them when they came saying, oh, what about lead exposure? And no, it's not a thing. And I've spoken to various doctors who just say, I've never seen any cases of lead poisoning.
Well, therefore, it just doesn't exist because I've never seen it.
It's because they've got this idea lead poisoning is an acute thing. And sure, you don't see many acute cases. There's only one child in the last few years who actually died from lead poisoning. But then you say, well, actually, I think you're seeing many cases of lead poisoning every day.
And you just don't know that you are. Exactly.
Yeah. You've got the miscarriages, preterm birth, through the whole.
My thing is high blood pressure.
Yeah, that's one.
Things like that where it's.
Yeah. Well, I was a few years ago, I was diagnosed as being autistic, but what we call high functioning autistic. And I think, well, I remember my father, he used to burn old paint, and I used to play with lead. I used to, I did a lot of soldering. I used to make model railways when I was young and did a lot of soldering. And I think, we were exposed to a lot of lead, as well as in gas. Of course, our whole environment was very leady.
Very leady.
I just find your approach, coming back to this concept of it's sensible. Andrea and I, maybe we have had this undercurrent of complete abatement. I think that's kind of one of the things that we've talked about. We haven't really talked about how do you live with lead. We've had an undercurrent of eradication. And it sounds like you have the perspective, a sensible one, that you can live with a door that has lead in it. And there are ways of increasing your safety. Would you say that that's a perspective that you have? Is that right?
Yeah, lead-free is impossible. Lead-safe is achievable. Look at our window. That's all lead lines on the window, but it's safe. It's outside, not on the inside lead. I would say the outside of this house is pretty toxic, but inside's okay. It is about being good enough. Basically, there is no way of avoiding lead and a lot of other things. Everything is everywhere. It's the levels that count. It's how much, how long, how often. That's what matters. You will never be free of toxins. We're being toxed all the time. Now, most of the time, your body can either repel or remove or repair the damage. It's only when the levels get too high that you can't. So
inconsistent too.
Yeah.
Consistency.
Yeah, if you're getting it every day, then of course, it's cumulative. That's the big problem.
Seeing those windows, they're lovely. I'm thinking the person that made those windows is probably no longer with us.
They're not old. They're about 3 or 4 years old.
Oh.
And before I realised how bad they could be. So we replaced the old windows in this house, the very same style, but they were basically single glazed with lead on both sides. Now we've got double glazing with lead on the outside. So they're still being installed. They're very popular and nobody knows. So this is one of these things, that gets installed into people's houses, no warnings. And okay, as long as you clean them with the same cloth that you wash your dishes with, maybe it's not too bad. But the problem is, and what I've found is that the surface underneath, it's not just that, the surface underneath the sill, that gets contaminated. Basically, you can install lead anywhere. I believe what we should be doing is saying, don't install lead where it can be accessible. So, and virtually if I said every house, somebody might be able to find one to disprove it, but nearly every building has lead on it. So around chimneys and roof joins and things like that, there'll be lead there. I took a soil sample outside our house and found it had 5,000 parts per million lead. That's about 0.5% of the soil was metallic lead. So we're very contaminated here. So our soil, in fact, our urban soil is above the safe level in the UK, our average urban soil.
Wow.
We're so bad. There was a kid in Bristol, one of the cities here, was a kid, the mother claimed a kid was poisoned by just being in the garden and playing
in the dirt.
Yeah, there is nothing to stop. And I see it all the time, people putting lead on the front door and then people just push with a hand and push it. In fact, there was a TV series recently and there was a scene of a mother holding a baby and a baby was rubbing his hand on the lead. You just, no. So,
wow.
Yeah,
this living with lead kind of opens up this notion.
Yeah.
It's pushing back on something that I think I've been thinking. Do you think then, is there a cultural argument for including lead in construction? Like the development of glass in some buildings or paint in fine art, there's a history behind that. So is that something, if we're not completely eradicating all lead, is there room for this cultural carve-outs, I guess? Do you think that's important, or is that something we need to explore more or mitigate? Or what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a cultural thing with builders. They say, we've always used lead. It's the best thing for the job. So therefore, we're going to carry on using it because there's nothing else like it. Nothing's going to last as long. And therefore, they carry on. There is the a lead sheet association, I think, in the UK, who give lots of advice about keeping safe to the installers, but they don't do anything then for the end consumer who's living in the property with lead lying all around it. And even new builds, I see huge amounts of lead put onto some buildings. So why don't we regulate this? Why don't people think it's a problem? Because there's no evidence, basically. And there's probably no evidence because it's very much a UK building style. And I've seen it a little bit in Belgium and the Netherlands, but most of the rest of the world don't put lead on the buildings the way we do in such huge quantities. So there isn't a lot of research to say it's causing any problems. So people will say, well, where's your evidence? We don't have it. Except anecdotally, I can say, yeah, the soil around my house is highly contaminated.
As far as like, well, you don't have the evidence, well, we're not testing for it. And here to get a test is very, very difficult. For kids, you can get it if they think that it's a risk. But for adults, it's not something where like, I want to get a lead test done. Well, unless you know that you're exposed, you can't really get one.
When you say it's difficult, do you mean it's just expensive? Because I can...
It's not. No, it's not. So that's the thing. My doctor, when I explained to her that I wanted one done just to see, and she's like, well, have you had exposure? And I tried explaining, and I think she told me the test. She's like, oh, well, yeah, the test is maybe like $10 or something like that. It was something very not expensive. Yeah. And I have insurance, and it was still not easy for me to get the test done.
I've had a test. It cost me £90.
Oh, really?
Over $100.
Interesting.
I would be surprised that you don't have private clinics that'll do that, because workers will need to be tested, don't they?
No. And that's the frustrating thing, because a lot of these people, then you're told, then you have to go here and you have to shell out this money. And if people are like, well, what's the point? I don't want to pay for that. Then they're not going to get tested. We did see, I think it was in New York, they did have places where you could get tested that were separate from, a clinic where you see your general practitioner. But that's the frustrating thing.
Other tests, I send my things for dust and soil to a lab in New Jersey because it's cheaper there.
Oh my gosh.
Even considering the postage. I'll get a dust test for $10 and a soil test, I think it was $25.
That's it.
Yeah.
After we're done with the interview, would you email us a link to them so that we could add it to the sources? Because I'd like to look into that.
So that's the sort of thing that I've had other people in the UK send their samples to the US for analysis, and then they can be reassured or not. The dust test is a good test because it tells you where the lead is.
Okay.
And it's not that expensive, really. So.
Yeah, there was a case here. They couldn't figure it out. And this kid, I think their levels were 60 or 70. And it's the strangest because the other child didn't have it. So the mom could not figure it out. And it was from the front door. And I mean, and it took for quite a while for them to figure it out. And they ended up having to move, which is just sad. 2 kids and having to figure that out on your own is just.
One of the other big things we don't do is screen children.
You don't.
There's no screening. So therefore, we've had.
So that means you don't have a problem because.
That's right.
Right? There's no problem.
So I had, it's not so much as that we haven't got the evidence for a problem.
Yes.
The evidence, it's very hard to get government attention when you can say, we've got a problem and Because they've got a problem in the US and use of lead in the UK is much worse. We've got the oldest housing stock in the world.
Yeah.
It's got to be worse here. But they'll say,
so that's what I was going to
not
say.
the same.
If lead is lead, it's not going to be any different here versus the UK. So wouldn't just what you said? Yeah, there's evidence. It's going to affect people the same.
Yeah, and also we've got if you've seen the UNICEF report called The Toxic Truth.
I have not seen that.
Search for UNICEF Toxic Truth. That's got some estimates of the number of children with elevated blood lead levels in every country, and also estimates of the cost. And that comes to about 2% of children in the UK would be lead poisons, which actually is the same as in the US. If you look at the CDC data, and you've got about 2% as well.
Wow.
Is there a movement or a historical, cultural change that you think would mirror what we need to do around our relationship with lead? Thinking of the Salk vaccine for tuberculosis, is there a kind of historical, cultural event or movement that we should be trying to replicate in order to make some real change in this area?
I would say the equivalent thing is asbestos.
Okay.
Asbestos tends to get more attention because it kills people. We've got something like 5,000 people are dying of mesothelioma in the UK. But this is the thing, that it's easy to measure mortality. It's harder to measure morbidity. Can you say how many IQ points have we lost? How many people with high blood pressure are due to lead poisoning? You've probably seen Bruce Lamsphere's analysis of cardiovascular mortality analysis, and I think he was reckoning 400,000 premature deaths in the US were caused by lead exposure. You've seen these numbers.
Wow.
I'll send you a link to our manifesto, so I've documented
Yes.
this stuff.
Oh, my Lord.
But there's not a lot of research into attribution rates. So if you were to ask the question, how many children exposed to lead go on to develop multi-conditions, you don't really get it. But I would have thought you could get that from Haynes, but I don't think anybody's done that analysis.
That just made me think too. Do you know of any research that is explaining or at least trying to figure out why lead does affect some people more than it does affect other people?
I've seen some of the epigenetic, that it's some people, there's particular people who have a genetic deficiency in their detoxification pathways. So therefore, they're less able to detoxify when they're exposed to things. So that's one thing.
Okay.
Then I've seen research about how lead interferes with DNA. There's a thing called methylation, because how every cell in your body has the same DNA, and lead can interfere with that. And particularly, it seems to be in the brain.
That is all the time we have for this week's episode of United States of Lead. Tune in next week for part 2 of our interview with Tim Pye from Lead Exposure and Poisoning Prevention Alliance. In the meantime, please check out the sources linked for more information on Lead Exposure and Poisoning Prevention Alliance and studies that were mentioned in this week's episode. Thanks for tuning in, and we will talk to you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in to United States of Lead, hosted by Andrea Elizabeth and Paul Kramer. Just a quick disclaimer, Andrea and Paul are not experts in lead poisoning. We do ask that you check our sources and read up a little bit more on your own. Thanks again for listening.